And at 10, 8 Aunt May and Mary Jane. Okay, so technically this is Spider-Man, but it's a zombie version of Spider-Man, but I'm gonna count it anyway because this is pretty damn messed up, zombie or not. On Earth 2149, an alien plague ends up infecting all superpowered individuals and turns them into zombies. However, it's later revealed that the Necronomicon from Evil Dead was actually what caused it. But after learning that the plague was actually like a bad thing, Peter ran home to get Aunt May and MJ the hell out of Dodge. But when he gets there, we get a good old case of protagonist syndrome and boom! Zombie Spider. He ends up becoming a zombie and eats the two most important people in his life. He also had a fractured jaw before becoming a zombie, so I'm sure you can imagine that this isn't a pretty sight, even by zombie standards. It may not be our Pete, but it was a version of Spider-Man, so it's fine. And at 9, Anna Marconi. Speaking of a version of Spider-Man, let's discuss the Superior Spider-Man and his fascination with Anna Marconi. Superior Spider-Man is actually Otto Octavius, who prior to the Superior Spider-Man storyline had brain swapped with Peter, yet a piece of Peter still remained in his own body, which convinced Otto to end up becoming a hero, albeit a darker one. Doc Ock was up to some really shady stuff while pretending to be Peter, cause you know, since Peter is young, handsome, in shape, and has actual women in his life, Otto tried his luck at getting MJ to sleep with him, but failed miserably. So, you know, things weren't going that well. But then there's Anna Marconi, whom this Otto-Peter hybrid started dating. She had no idea what the real situation was going on inside that noggin, and while it's unclear if they ever actually hopped on the good foot and did the bad thing, it's obvious that things were at least heading in that direction. Otto was in love with her, which was a surprise since he even decided to give Peter back his body to save her, but it was still an absolutely horrific story, immoral, in the highest class of the word. It's creepy as hell and it makes me rethink all relationships. And at 8, interfered with surgery. In the same series as the Anna Marconi situation, the small bit of Peter that was left in his body was trying to regain control, for obvious reasons, because, you know, a supervillain was piloting his bone mech with meat armor. This small bit of Peter though was at times able to interfere or even control Otto temporarily. One of these moments came in Superior Spider-Man number 8, where there was a device that was capable of wiping Pete from Otto's brain, but to get it he had to perform surgery on a little girl. However, Peter didn't think that Otto could do it, so he tries to stop Otto from even performing the surgery, while he has his Spider-Man mask on, may I add, and an additional face mask, so if evil Spider-Man can do it, so can you. Even still, trying to prevent the surgery to save a little girl's life is a pretty low moment for the Barnacle, even if it was filled with good intentions. Kind of. Those only power crystals, you know. Actually, is that how it works? I don't know. I don't think like Topaz is gonna cure my depression or something. And at 7, scarring Harry Osborn. While Spider-Man 3 in and of itself is one of the most despicable things that Spider-Man has done, well, with the exception of that sweet dance scene, one of the most horrible things actually in the movie is during the final fight between Harry and Peter. Peter shows up at Harry's house wearing the black symbiote costume and is mad about Goblin Jr. being the reason that MJ left Peter. However, this fight is about more than that, since Harry still blames Peter for killing his father, and Peter is done trying to convince him. After wailing on him a little bit, Peter kicks Harry into the path of a rogue glider, sending him flying into a shelf of good old-fashioned pumpkin bombs. After some mental torment, he knocks Harry out against the wall, at least so he thinks. But in fact, Harry is awake, and as Peter is walking away, Harry decides to chuck a pumpkin bomb at Pete, who dodges it thanks to his spider sense, but then thanks to the symbiote throws it back at Harry, causing it to explode basically right next to his face. If it weren't for the Goblin Serum, Harry would definitely be dead, and honestly, even with it, I'm surprised that he survived. But you do have to admit, it was pretty damn cold, but Harry also did kind of deserve it. And at 6, assorted killings. For being a hero that has a strict no-killing rule, Spider-Man has killed quite a few people, but perhaps most notably Logan's friend Charlie, in the graphic novel Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from 1987. The plot of this is that both Wolverine and Spidey end up in Berlin for their own reasons, and as the title suggests, Wolverine and Spider-Man end up fighting each other, in a graveyard to be exact. The fight is actually a good one, with Spidey even having the mindset to kill Wolverine because Logan might kill him first. They don't know each other that well at this point. The fight ends only when a helicopter of bad guys shows up looking for Logan's friend Charlie. Wolverine wanted to help his friend stop killing, but now since this helicopter showed up, Wolverine wants to kill her quick, since, you know, they aren't going to. Which he doesn't actually have to do because Spider-Man does. After Charlie intentionally sets off his spider sense and gets a super-powered spider punch to the face, killing her instantly. Halfway through and at number 5, kissed Gwen's daughter. After learning that your father isn't actually your father, but rather your mother's ex who she cheated on with his worst enemy, what do you think you would do? Also, you're aging more rapidly because your real father has some form of goblin serum in his system that somehow passed on to you, but you only age up physically, so you're mentally 10 with the body of an adult. yeah, you may want to skip this number. Since Pete and Sarah end up getting closer after fighting off dealers in Paris, but this was made even worse when they're in Paris without MJ, who Peter didn't bring for whatever reason. The thing is though, Peter thinks that this is entirely platonic. This just goes to show you that if your partner thinks that someone's trying to get with you, you should listen. Because lo and behold, Sarah ends up planting one on her almost dad, just as MJ shows up for a surprise visit. And I think the name of the storyline, Sins Remembered, is way too fitting and is definitely going to be seared into my brain now. God damn it. You thought that Gwen and Green Goblin was bad? Oh boy. And it forestalled his marriage. After siding with Tony in the events of the first Civil War, Spider-Man has to reveal his identity to the world in order to continue fighting crime. And you know, since now every supervillain on Earth knows how to get to Spider-Man, Kingpin ends up attacking Peter at his home. He dodges the bullets, but they end up hitting Aunt May instead, putting her in critical condition. This is the start of the One More Day storyline, probably the most universally hated Spider-Man run of all time. Since in order to save Aunt May, Peter talks to Mephisto and ends up selling his marriage to MJ in order to save his aunt. So their entire marriage will get erased so that he can have at least one more day with his aunt. Aside from living with the consequences of your actions, because you know, that's not what heroes do. Which is also pretty goddamn horrible. You wanna know what else is pretty goddamn horrible? Like, MJ had to agree to it as well, or at least she had to say that she did. But like, seriously, if you're being realistic, okay? How many years does Aunt May really have left? Okay, like, honestly, not many. So selling your marriage to bring back your one foot in the grave aunt just seems like a not so even trade to me. I'm just saying. MJ's gonna be around for longer. You heard it right, ladies. I'd let my old aunt die for you. Hit me up. Getting close to the end into number 3, One Moment in Time. The One Moment in Time story comes after the One More Day story, and this seems to be the storyline that No Way Home is taking inspiration from. However, after saving Aunt May, Wilson Fisk ends up sending a hitman after MJ's Aunt Anna Watson, but the hitman, revealed to be Eddie Brock, ends up attacking Mary Jane. Peter takes the wounded MJ to Doctor Strange, who heals her, but Peter also insists that Doctor Strange performs a spell that causes everyone to forget that he's Spider-Man, because again, not living with the consequences of his actions. Strange contacts Iron Man and Mr. Fantastic for advice, and they end up agreeing with him eventually. They do, however, decide that nobody should remember who Peter is aside from Peter. Not Doctor Strange, not Tony, not Mr. Fantastic, not MJ. But Peter, being Peter, jumps out of his protective bubble and grabs MJ and pulls her in before the spell's complete. They wake up in a motel and Peter explains what happened. Mary Jane asks why he couldn't just let her forget, and then she explains that she can't be with him because it's only a matter of time before somebody rips off his mask again and they go after her family, and that's a danger that she can't let happen. Back in the present though, Mary Jane also explains that he has to move on and find somebody who can be with him. Should've just let her forget it, man. Penultimately, into number 2, Hit Mary Jane. To get things straight, I understand that finding out that you're actually a clone and that the real Peter Parker has been living his life for the past few years as Ben Reilly because he thought he was the clone would be pretty earth-shattering, but nonetheless, it doesn't excuse this behavior. You may be under a lot of stress, but you never hit or take it out on your partner in any way whatsoever. No matter what gender you are or aren't, you just don't, okay? But Peter didn't get that memo for a minute, since in the Clone Wars storyline after finding this out, Peter and Ben are in the middle of a scrap. Mary Jane admittedly doesn't make the brightest move though when she attempts to break the two up, but Peter instinctively backhands her across the room, a moment we see referenced in Spider-Man 3 in the cafe that MJ works at. However, in the comic, Mary Jane was actually currently pregnant with his child, and while Peter does instantly regret this and is filled with shame and guilt, he runs away. He doesn't check on his pregnant wife. He flees and joins up with Jackal, so yeah. Not the finest moment there, dude. Finally, in at number 1, Killed Mary Jane. I know I say I hate talking about this, but honestly, if I have to suffer through this knowledge, so does everyone else. It's like my own way of being a supervillain. In the Spider-Man Reigns storyline, it's revealed that Mary Jane is dead, but it's also revealed later on why she's dead, since she was married to Peter, and as I've mentioned, did eventually want to have kids with him. The thing is though, a radioactive spider bite in your hand does more to a man than lets him stick to walls and perform incredible acrobatics. It also fills that man with radiation, and anything else he feels also gets filled with radiation, if you catch my drift. Whether you're role-playing a lab experiment or not, that's what ended up happening after all, since Mary Jane ends up dying of cancer thanks to the radiation that Peter was packing in those swimmers. Yeah, it's absolutely horrible, and while yes, it's a question that everyone had, It's not something we ever wanted an answer to, especially if this is the way that it was gonna go. And at 10, an affair. Now, Betty Brant got married in Amazing Spider-Man number 156 and headed off to Paris for a honeymoon that doubled as a work assignment for her and her new husband, reporter Ned Leeds. However, in Amazing Spider-Man issue 183, we see Peter propose to Mary Jane and her turn him down, which puts him in a pretty dark place, which means that when Betty shows up in Peter's apartment in Amazing Spider-Man 184, there are going to be some issues. However, Betty claims to have left Ned on their honeymoon, while also on assignment together. But here's the biggest kicker. She never told Ned that she was leaving him, but she still intends on sparking a romantic relationship with Peter, which he ends up shutting her down in number 186, telling her that he can't be with her. But she doesn't take no for an answer, and in issue 187 makes her own move and just goes for the kiss, saying, "Shut up darling, just kiss me." The next panel then cuts to a few hours later, which sparked the debate whether he and Betty actually ended up bumping more than lips. And then Ned ends up threatening to kill Peter if he doesn't stay out of Betty's life. So, yeah. And at 9, failed Gwen. There are multiple instances of Spider-Man failing Gwen Stacy, both in the comics and in the movies. The more recent moment being in Amazing Spider-Man 2 starring Andrew Garfield. In both instances, Gwen Stacy is killed thanks to the Green Goblin, although in the comics it was debated for ages whether or not Peter was to blame, since he could have been the reason her neck snapped. It was also debated whether or not she was dead before the plummet, but I think we can all agree that she fell for him. She fell head over heels. And this idea that it was Peter's fault was only added onto in The Amazing Spider-Man, since the only reason Gwen was there was because Peter couldn't stay away from her, because he didn't give his blood to Harry, and then because he was relying more on his webs than his physical ability as Spider-Man. But at least the Tobey Maguire version didn't end up having any issues with Gwen Stacy, right? Oh wait. And at 8, kissed Gwen. While the comic version and the second movie version ended up getting their Gwens killed, Tobey's version ended up saving his when she fell out of a building in Spider-Man 3. Doing this even earned him the key to the city. And while a lot of the bad things that Peter does in this movie can be written off as the symbiote, at this point, Peter hasn't gotten it yet. So, when at the ceremony, when he was going to get to the key to the city, he decided to go the extra mile and let Gwen kiss him while he was hanging upside down. That's entirely on him. Something that Mary Jane, his current girlfriend, who was also at the ceremony and knew his identity, didn't enjoy. Especially because firstly, that was like their kiss theme, because like it was the kiss that they had after he saved her in the first movie. And secondly, because she left J. Jonah Jameson's son at the altar for Peter, and then this man goes and kisses another girl right in front of her doing their thing. Yeah, that's a total move. That a horrible idea. As an empath, I know how MJ was feeling in that instance, but I really don't get why he thought that this was a good idea. Like, yeah, sure, the papers will love it, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. You aren't even getting pictures of this to sell to JJ, so like, what's the point of pissing off your girl? Horrible move overall. And at 7, almost killed Shocker. The 90s animated series for Spider-Man has a lot going for it. I love the series and have watched it many times. In fact, I'm watching it right now again. But the things this Peter did while using the symbiote suit are kind of messed up. For instance, JJJ ends up putting up a bounty on him for accusations of thievery. But when people start using sonic weapons, he ends up trying to blow them up. There is literally a line where he says, "My suit has cruise control, but your suits have backpacks that blow up when they get wet." Yeah, well, he then breaks a fire hydrant to shower them with water, which basically would have killed them if they didn't run away. He also almost killed Shocker during their battle at the church, just before Brock becomes Venom and Peter loses the symbiote. He saves him just in the nick of time, but it's certainly not a good look for a show that will really only say destroy and not kill. Like, the Punisher comes in and they say lethal force, and then that's it. And then like one episode, Spider-Man says that the Spot doesn't look like a killer, but that's the only time they have anything close to the word kill. I mean, like, I get it, like it was the 90s and they didn't really go that dark, but still. And at 6, the Ferry. While attempting to stop a weapons deal, Spider-Man gets into a fight with a vulture that nearly destroys a ferry full of people in Spider-Man Homecoming. And while it was totally meant to be like the most innocent thing, it certainly wasn't a smart idea. Honestly, Spider-Man should have just thrown the weapon into the ocean as a way to stop it instead of webbing it onto onto the boat. But technically, I guess he didn't know what it could do, but it was also still firing on its own when no one was holding it, which should have been enough warning that this wouldn't end well. However, he webs an energy weapon to the ground and then it splits the ferry in half. He does his best to save it, but only ends up being 98% successful. Like, it was working until some dude gets a little too excited and starts clapping and breaking the webbing, which wouldn't really be Peter's fault. But then when the webs start to break, Pete just kind of like sits there and watches and doesn't really try to repair anything. He eventually jumps in to try to grab one web, but like plenty had broken before this, so he should have kept going. As soon as she said 98% successful, you go out and you do it again. Like, come on, bro. Halfway through into number 5, tried to kill Sandman. This is something from Spider-Man 3 that we could consider to be because of the symbiote. However, considering how Peter wanted to kill the guy he thought killed his uncle when he first got his powers, I don't think the symbiote has much to do with this instance of him wanting his uncle's killer dead either. Sure, he's a little more aggressive about it. Like, without the suit, he probably would have asked a couple questions first, but I think that ultimately the fact that he wanted his uncle's killer dead was the driving force behind this. I mean, like, the suit definitely made him like really go for it, but he wanted it. Obviously, he doesn't end up actually killing Marco, but he certainly thought he did. He was proud of it too, even telling Aunt May, who he won't even tell that he's Spider-Man to, despite not living at home anymore and her being attacked by enemies multiple times, and then getting mad at him when he runs off because he has some Spider-Manning to do. He really only snaps out of it when Aunt May tells him that what Spider-Man did was pretty messed up. But like, I feel like she kinda like knew. Like, she was like, yeah, that's up, man. Spider-Man shouldn't have done that. Do you think that this version of Aunt May knew that he was Spider-Man, or do you think that she was oblivious? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. In it for Broken Promise. Okay, spoiler alert for No Way Home, since I feel like I still need to give a warning about it, even though the movie was released last year. So for this and number 2, there's a Spider-Man No Way Home warning in effect. Okay, if you haven't seen it, go do that, because it's an amazing movie. But the ending had me wailing. So as we know in the climax of the movie, spoiler alert, at the Statue of Liberty, we see the multiverse crack open and everyone who ever knew that Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker is now coming through. So in an effort to stop this from happening, Peter tells Doctor Strange to cast a new spell, this time that makes everyone forget about Peter Parker, including Doctor Strange, his best friend, and his girlfriend. In this case being Ned and MJ, not Doctor Strange's best friend and girlfriend. Peter goes to say goodbye and tells his friends that he will find them and remind them of everything they've been through. MJ says that she loves him and then tells him to say it when he finds her after the spell. The spell is cast and then Peter just doesn't remind MJ and Ned because he thinks that they're safer without him. While this ending is perfect and sets up a new trilogy where the main complaint of him being Iron Boy Jr. is gone, it still breaks my heart. It's like this is like the same thing that happens at the end of my favorite book. So yeah, the Broken Promise thing, on my list for sure. Getting close to the end, and in number 3, threatened Kingpin. Spider-Man was in a weird place during the Civil War arc at Marvel Comics. After revealing his identity to the public, he was at odds with Tony Stark over the Superhuman Registration Act, which made Peter a wanted man. On the run, Peter, Aunt May, and MJ ended up hiding in a rundown motel while he was a fugitive. However, the Kingpin ended up hiring a hitman to put a hit on Spider-Man. It resulted in Aunt May accidentally being shot instead, leaving her critically injured. Peter would give her a blood transfusion, and while she was in a coma, he went after Wilson Fisk. Peter confronted the mob boss in a prison and gave him a fate worse than death. He defeated him in front of everyone. Peter beat the absolute living snot out of Kingpin, like absolutely to a pulp, but refused to kill him at the moment because he realized that a supervillain living with everyone knowing he can be beaten, especially Kingpin, was better than ending his life. But also mentioned that if Aunt May did die from this, he would come back and fill his lungs with webbing and watch him suffocate, which is incredibly dark, but also kind of makes sense. I'm surprised he didn't say something like, I will pull your face off your body by just not stopping the sticking of my hand to your bald head. But hey, I guess that's just my thinking. That's what I would do. Penultimately, in number 2, Bitter. Again, another spoiler warning for Spider-Man No Way Home. However, this time around, it isn't about the MCU Peter Parker, rather Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Thanks to the multiverse and the return of the Amazing Spider-Man actor, we got to see how Andrew's Spider-Man went on after the death of Gwen Stacy. And while the writers wanted to focus on Tom's Spider-Man rather than the other two and not let them steal the show, which the actors agreed to, we still got some more story about where Andrew and Tobey went after their series completed. One such reveal was that Andrew's Peter stopped pulling his punches and got bitter. heavily implying that his Spider-Man ended up killing someone, be it intentional or not, which some have also linked to the Morbius trailer, since there is graffiti in one of the scenes with the word murderer spray painted over Sam Raimi's Spider-Man suit. However, that pose is also from a loading screen in Spider-Man PS4, so it's safe to assume that it's just a placeholder for the actual movie, potentially to prevent any spoiler about what happened to the Spideys after their movie's concluded. Do you want to see an Amazing Spider-Man 3 where like he fights Venom or something? I don't know, let me know down below, I kinda do. And finally, into number 1, Spider Carnage. Spider Carnage isn't just the Spider-Man villain, he's actually an alternate version of Spider-Man. Hailing from one of the many Earths, this character was introduced in the 90s Spider-Man animated series. Again, my favorite Spider-Man animated series. This Peter's life was actually very similar to the main Spider-Man, except his version also lost Aunt May and developed a resentment for humanity. And then he had to deal with a clone, which definitely sucked. Until he and the clone learned that they didn't know who was actually the clone. Cause like, you know, the one going by Ben Reilly could have actually been the real Peter Parker. And this broke this version of Peter, who was actually still Peter. A Carnage symbiote from another universe actually ended up sensing this hatred and resentment for humanity, and through a portal created by Jonathan Ohm, it bonded with Peter, driving him even more insane and then starting to call himself Spider Carnage. From my understanding, this character hasn't been seen since that final episode, but I still want him to like come back in some aspect because this is so messed up but so good. Please, like add this character to the MCU or let Andrew Garfield fight a version of the Carnage symbiote and then create Spider Carnage or fight off Spider Carnage or something, please. He wanted to fight an alien, so can we please do that? Please. Also, where's the pop figure? They came out with 90s Spider-Man pop figures, but not Spider Carnage? What the hell?
Almost let a little girl die in surgery. In Amazing Spider-Man number 700, Doc Ock switches minds with Spider-Man. Sort of. Doc Ock, now in Spider-Man's body, is exposed to all of Peter's memories and experiences, and it definitely has an effect. He decides to become a superhero, calling himself the Superior Spider-Man. However, in the first issue of Superior Spider-Man, it's revealed that a portion of Peter is still residing inside of the body, and it has some control over Doc Ock's actions. So later in Superior Spider-Man number 8, the Superior Spidey finds a device that he can use to get rid of the last bits of Peter Parker that remain in his brain. However, in order to gain access to this device, he first has to perform surgery on a little girl. So this leads to a scene where Ghost Spider-Man is like in the background, basically trying to prevent Doc Ock from doing the surgery, knowing that Doc is going to finish off Peter Parker after he's successful. However, Peter does eventually relent and Doc succeeds in his surgery, but for a moment there it kind of seemed like Pete was ready to let a little girl die so that he could live. Not exactly Spidey's finest hour.
Number 9, killed MJ. So Peter's track record when it comes to loved ones isn't as bad as someone like Daredevil, but hey, it isn't great either. In alternate universes especially, Spider-Man has caused a lot of harm to those that he's loved, and I mean a lot. And even in the main continuity, his track record isn't so great. In the Marvel Zombies universe, Spider-Man was transformed into a zombie, and as this happened, felt the uncontrollable urge taking over him. He was like, I'm so hungry, I gotta eat people. He tried to tell his loved ones to get away from him, but it was too late, and he ended up not only killing, but full on eating both Mary Jane and his Aunt May. Of course, can we really blame Peter for this one? Not so much. He was a zombie and he wasn't really in control here. But knowing Peter, you can bet he likely reminisced and blamed himself continuously for this for days on end, even while he was a zombie. Because, you know, Peter just loves to blame himself for everything. And before we move on to this next spot, just a quick little reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it. It really helps us out at the channel, and thank you if you've already done it.
Number 8. Allowed a kidnapping. In Amazing Spider-Man number 112, we see Spider-Man really worried about Aunt May. She's gone missing after Gwen Stacy gave her a hard time for meddling in Peter's life too much, and he spent most of the previous issue searching for Aunt May. In this issue, we see Spidey has become so distracted, he doesn't even notice this guy getting kidnapped nearby. What's worse, when Pete does notice this guy, who also notices him, he starts the classic Spidey monologue about how helping this poor slob will take hours. Hours he could spend searching for Aunt May. He actually leaves the guy to get kidnapped, saying, maybe someday I'll have the courage to face myself again. Damn, Pete, you could have easily stopped and saved this guy. If that wasn't bad enough, later on it turns out that Aunt May wasn't even missing, she just had a new job. Way to go, Spidey.
Number 7, worst boyfriend ever. I wish I could say this was a one-time instance, but this is one of the worst, most consistent things that we've seen from Peter Parker throughout all of his relationships. He's not only super awkward around the ladies, but also has a tendency to behave badly with his romantic partners as well. For one, Peter very rarely lets people in on his secret of being Spider-Man, which causes a lot of problems early on in relationships that usually end up causing a breakup before things get super serious. And you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, Amanda, hasn't Peter Parker told Mary Jane before that he's Spider-Man? Yes, but she also apparently knew from like day one that he was Spider-Man, so I don't know if that even counts because she knew the whole time. But beyond that, he also says, thinks, and does kind of things that are just in general awful. He snapped at his partners, lied to them, gotten them into all kinds of danger, blamed them for things that weren't their fault, and even at times physically hit them. Like when Mary Jane tried to break up a fight between Peter Parker and his clone Ben Reilly, and in a mindless rage he slammed her back, causing her to go flying into a wall. Also, Spider-Man is super strong, so even if he like flicked Mary Jane, I imagine that would be terribly painful. Oh, and she was also pregnant at the time with their child, which just makes it even worse.
Number 6. He almost robbed a jewelry store. Okay, I know this isn't supposed to be top 10 things Spider-Man almost did, but I have to mention another really weird out of character Spider-Man moment. In Amazing Spider-Man number 87, Spidey has been suffering from an illness that he determines to be the radioactivity in his blood slowly killing him. He's been feeling delirious for a while and having a hard time using his powers properly, and he's swinging around the city, monologuing, wondering what it means for his future. Suddenly, he remembers it's Gwen Stacy's birthday, classic Peter, and he doesn't have a gift. So in a bizarre moment, we see Spider-Man randomly decide to break into a jewelry store and he steals a necklace for her. He realizes what he's doing before it's too late and he kind of like puts it back, but he's already caused property damage and like, you know, thank God they don't have cameras because Jameson would just have a field day with that. The whole thing is just a really weird moment. Spider-Man starting to wonder if he's losing his mind. The whole thing was really surprising to me and he almost went through with it.
Number 5, killed MJ. Again! Yeah, for someone who claims to love her so much, Peter is not very good at treating MJ well. This one comes to us from another alternate reality though, so we do have to, you know, asterisk and add that in there, little editor note. Because of course, Peter would never kill Mary Jane in the main continuity, or more, he just hasn't done so yet. In the reality of Spider-Man Reign, we're taken to a potential future reality where Peter killed Mary Jane simply by loving her. Their being intimate, at least that's what's implied, caused Mary Jane to be exposed to Peter's radioactivity at a level where she ended up getting cancer and dying. His radioactive fluids. Yeah, that's pretty intense. In typical Peter fashion, this becomes one of his greatest regrets, giving MJ cancer, and only serves to basically drive him insane and turn him senile, which really doesn't help anyone and makes for a pretty crazy story when he returns as a bizarre and depressed version of Old Man Spider-Man. Old Man Spider-Man is super depressing.
Number 4. Worked for the JACKAL. The whole clone saga was definitely one of Spidey's lowest points, especially just the way that they totally messed with Peter's character throughout the whole thing. He was calling himself the Spider and just acting generally unpleasant, but when he found out that he wasn't the real Peter Parker but a clone, he really didn't receive that news very well. The JACKAL somehow ends up convincing Pete to work with him, and somehow Peter buys it, even though it means working against his friend Ben Reilly. Peter eventually does come to his senses, but man, how could he have ever been convinced to work with a supervillain in the first place? You know, every time I look back on this era, I remember why people hate it so much. Both versions of Spider-Man are pretty decent, but the way that they're pitted against one another as if there can only be one and everything, the whole thing just felt kind of forced.
Number 3 was too apathetic. Spider-Man's apathy is something that haunts him to this day and makes him pretty much the one to blame for his Uncle Ben's death. Well, I mean, I personally think Peter is much too hard on himself here, and that being that harsh only leads to more disasters later down the road that his intense sense of responsibility has a hand in causing, but I digress. Peter for sure thinks this is the worst thing he has ever done, allowing the man who would go on to kill his uncle to get past him. At the time when the guard who pursued the criminal asked for help, Peter Peter simply didn't see the point in aiding. That wasn't his job, he thought. He wasn't a hero. However, afterward he learned that with great power comes great responsibility, a lesson that has haunted him and continues to both haunt and inspire him to this day.
Number 2. He killed Charlemagne. In the one-shot Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from 1987, we get to witness an epic showdown between these two fan favorites. Peter winds up in Germany investigating a mysterious arms dealer. Charlemagne turns out to be an old associate of Wolverine's, and she's got all kinds of people after her. They track her to East Berlin, where Wolverine plans to kill her, sparing her from being tortured by the KGB. Spider-Man isn't really cool with the whole killing her part of the plan, so the two of them have a bit of a fight about it. However, after a helicopter breaks up the fight for a second, Peter's spidey sense kicks in, and thinking that Wolverine is behind him, he turns around and delivers a full-powered punch, instantly killing Charlemagne. It's implied that she probably intended for this to happen, as she was wanting to die and stuff, but still, if you had told me that Spider-Man once punched a woman with no superpowers and killed her in one hit, I'd be a little skeptical. But it really happened.
Number 1. Probably killed Gwen Stacy. Once again, Peter is causing harm to those he loves. What's more, this whole moment where he attempted to save Gwen and we hear her neck snap is made even worse for Peter in terms of his own guilt over the situation by the fact that he never really knows if it was him or if it was Green Goblin who is to blame for her death. Was she dead before he grabbed her, or did she die when his webbing latched on to save her, breaking her neck? We still don't really know for sure, although I think Green Goblin claims that she died while she was falling. He's like, a fall like that, she'd die before she hits the ground. And I'm like, wait, is that how falling works? It's not. Anyways. I mean, either way, Peter Parker is kind of to blame here, as Green Goblin has a tendency to target those that Spider-Man loves. So once again, just loving Gwen was in a way a terrible thing for him to do to her.